Number 1. Discovery. I've heard some stories of people having similar experiences to the ones that I sometimes get when I'm hiking. Even though you're hiking out in the forests and hills, you can come across old abandoned barns and sheds. I used to come across all sorts of strange structures when I was out hiking around. I guess the reason that the barns were there was because back in the day people had cows grazing on the hills. However, it had not been that way for quite a long time in my area. For the most part, there wasn't anything special about the abandoned buildings. They were typically empty except for old wooden furnishings and rusted tools. They were still interesting to explore for the simple reason that they were curiosities. I liked to wonder how long they had been abandoned, who had owned them, and what they were used for. I mean, I guess none of that seems really interesting or remotely important, but it was always interesting to me. There was only one time when I ever found an interesting abandoned building while out on a hike. This happened not around my own home, but while my family were visiting relatives in a different state. I was a teenager at the time, and really not at all interested in the conversations my family had. I had been out in the hills by my aunt's house before, but I was nowhere near as familiar with them as I was the area around my own home. And this day I did leave to go hiking rather early in the morning, and I planned on being out for the whole day. Well, although I went hiking a lot, I still tended to occasionally get lost. And this was one of those times that this happened. I just did it for fun. I didn't bring a compass or anything like that. I also have no talent in looking at the sky and knowing which direction I'm going in. So I ended up being out a lot later than I expected to be, and I was trying to find my way home. When I went over a hill, I noticed a moderate-sized barn at the bottom of the hill. Even though it wasn't really a good idea, as I was lost and trying my best to find my way home, I decided I wanted to go and check out the barn. It was unlikely I would ever have the chance to see the structure again. By the time I got down the hill, I looked up at the sky. Although I couldn't tell where I was, I could tell that there would not be a lot of light left in the day. I decided that no matter what, I would be doing some hiking in the dark, so there was no real reason I shouldn't check out the barn. I couldn't get the normal smaller door opened, so I realized I would have to open the big front barn doors, if I could. Again, I almost considered just forgetting about it and deciding to find my way home, but I did decide I would give it a shot. It took a bit of effort, but I was able to open one of the front barn doors. There wasn't a lot of light, and with the area the barn was in, there was really no way to get much light in it. Fortunately, I had brought a flashlight with me in case I got caught out in the dark, so I took it out and began shining it around the barn. I walked around as I shined the flashlight around. There wasn't a whole lot to see. It was obvious that this place had been abandoned for a very long time. And then I froze, and I saw something weird laying up against an old pile of gross and moldy hay. And when I came in for a closer look, I froze again when I realized what I was seeing. A long, dead, decayed body was lying up against the hay. There was a pitchfork sticking through the neck of the body and into the hay. The body was so old that there was very little I could actually tell about it. It was mostly bones and clothes and other gross stuff that I really don't want to know what it was. But it was undoubted that the person died from a pitchfork to the throat. And seeing how the body was still in the abandoned barn after all this time, it pretty much made sense that it was likely a murder. After I got through the shock, I closed the barn door and left. I wasn't scared that something would happen to me. Again, this possible murder had happened a long time ago. There was no reason to believe I was in any danger, but it doesn't mean I wasn't scared. My mind was full of ideas about how and why the man was killed. Thinking about that, and why, and wondering how long the person was missed, or looked for, or anything, just created a bunch of unpleasant thoughts. And those were the scariest. I had been out in the dark for a while, when I eventually did get back to my aunt's house. I explained what happened and they called the county sheriff the following day. The details really aren't that important. The man who had owned the barn had also died a long time ago, so it was unlikely anything would ever be discovered as to why the man was killed. In a way, that's one of the scariest things about the whole experience. Number 2. Warnings. This story might seem a bit incredible at first, and by that, I don't mean what a lot of people assume that word means. It means that it'll be hard to believe, and I have little doubt that some people will not believe me. That is fine, of course, and I won't hold it against anyone, but this is a true story. Me and my buddy Joel went hiking one fall. I always preferred hiking in the fall because it was cooler outside, and I also liked the colors of the trees more in the fall. We liked to go to different places all the time. We may have gotten lost once or twice before, but that was not something that was very usual. We were both very experienced hikers. The first couple of days and nights, nothing really happened. We had a nice time hiking, but there was nothing unusual. It was very casual, cool hike through the woods. We didn't see a lot of wildlife apart from birds and a few small animals. That wasn't too unusual for the time of year that we went hiking. We did expect to see some deer or something like that. For the most part, there was nothing too out of the ordinary that we came across. It was like any other camping and hiking trip. The third morning was when something weird happened. The night had passed as normally as any other night before it. Again, nothing unusual. But when I got up and was getting ready to make something to eat, something caught my eye over there on Joel's tent. It was like a yellow vertical line painted on his tent. I hadn't noticed it before, and I just figured I'd ask him about it when he woke up. I went about making breakfast, and I guess the smell of it woke Joel up. He always slept a bit later than I did. But he got up, and after going behind a tree for a few moments, he came over to the fire to get something to eat. And when he did, however, he had a strange and quizzical look on his face. "What's that on your tent?" he asked me. Looking back to where he was pointing, I then noticed it for the first time. There was a yellow vertical line on my tent, too. I mentioned I had seen one on his tent, and then he looked back on it and noticed it too. He confirmed that he had nothing to do with either line. I cannot tell you if I believed him or not, because honestly I didn't know. Joel wasn't much of a prankster or a liar. Hell, even if he was, painting a yellow line on a tent would be one of the lamest practical jokes I could even imagine. I mean, what would it even mean? We didn't think very much about it after that. I guess on some level both of us expected that the other one was responsible, and it was easy to put out of our minds. The following morning I got up and exited my tent to get ready for breakfast. This time, when I looked at the tents, I noticed something else. A second vertical line was drawn right beside the first one. I checked out both tents, and they were on both tents. So at that point, I was positive that Joel had something to do with it. When Joel got up, I told him that he might as well admit his joke to me. He seemed confused at first, until he noticed it too. "Why would you think I had anything to do with that?" he asked me. My only response to him was that if I hadn't done it, then he must have. Joel countered that it made more sense to him that I was playing a practical joke. I always woke up before him, and he was a sounder sleeper than me. Probably not shockingly, things were a bit tense that day. Both of us seemed convinced that the other one was behind what was going on. I mean, we were not mad at each other. We still had a really good time. But we were both wary of each other. It was obvious. I guess that alone should have told me that neither of us were responsible. But it's easier to see those things when you are removed from the situation. The next few mornings were pretty much the same. On the fifth morning, we saw something that finally explained what the vertical lines meant. Rather than a fifth vertical line on our tents, there was a diagonal line cutting through the previous four. It was someone counting something down, counting the days until something happened maybe. That in itself was odd, but it was nothing like what happened the following morning. I stepped in something sticky. When I looked down, there was a puddle of blood right outside my tent. I looked immediately over at Joel's tent. Yeah, he had a puddle of blood right in front of his tent too. I got Joel up, and I think for the first time, neither of us suspected the other of playing a joke or anything. Someone else was doing those things while we were sleeping. And for the first time, I think the two of us were a little frightened. And to top everything off, there was another vertical line drawn after the 5 count. The following morning I was very careful in coming out of my tent. This time there was no puddle of blood, however. There were a couple of dead birds in front of my tent, and a couple in front of Joel's tent also. At this point, the frightened feelings began to turn into fear, and of course, there was another vertical line on each of our tents. Joel and I had a discussion about what we thought we should do. Someone was fucking with us, but we had no way of knowing if they were just fucking with us, or if it was something serious here. We decided that we would try and remain awake the following night. If someone was riding on our tents and leaving blood and dead animals in our campsite, then we would be able to catch them if we stayed up. And because we both couldn't stay up all night, we set up little shifts and set our watches so we would know when the other was awake. I figured that whatever was going on, we were going to figure out that night. I went and took the first shift. It was scary, I won't deny it. I mean, it was scary enough when the sun went down, but it was much scarier when I could hear Joel snoring from his tent. At that point, a bit of paranoia began to set in. I felt not only scared but alone. I also had nothing to keep my mind occupied. I couldn't use anything with lights or noise because that would give away that I was awake. So all I had to keep me occupied were my thoughts, and that was not really the best idea. Generally you become habituated to the noise out in the woods, but I was hearing everything very loud and very clear. The crickets, the frogs, and every other sound was just magnified, and all the time I was expecting to see or hear something, whether that would be the light of a flashlight, or hearing someone approaching or talking. What I feared most, though, was seeing someone in silhouette, painting a vertical line on the outside wall of my tent. Time went by really slow. Although my anticipation was high, nothing did happen during my shift. When Joe indicated to me that he was awake, I went to sleep, and I assumed because I was so tired that I would fall asleep rather quickly, and I did. But it was very rough sleeping throughout the night. I was confused in the morning, though. A decapitated deer's head was sitting by our fire. Once again, a vertical line appeared on my tent. Joel and I were both confused. Not only that, we were sure that the other one of us either slept during our watch or missed something, but we couldn't decide what. Once again, I began getting a little suspicious of him, but he also seemed to get that way about me. In the end, we decided not to blame each other for anything that was going on. We just decided that there was something going on, and obviously someone that did not want us in those woods. We didn't know what the numbers were counting up to, but also we didn't want to find out. So we decided to find the fastest way that we could to get out of that area. Interestingly enough, when we changed our course, the strange happening stopped. That made us both realize that we must have been headed towards something that someone did not want us to see, and we were fine for not seeing it. We, however, did not choose to spend our entire time out there. We got out and never went back. Number 3. Camping. This is not a really long story, and when it comes down to it, the scariness of it is something that is realized more than experienced. I'll explain. I enjoy going on short hiking trips by myself. They're not like these week-long trips that you sometimes hear about in these stories. This was just a weekend camping trip in the area around my home. It's a rural area, but it's not like, Blair Witch Project woods. You weren't going to get lost and travel around for days. You may get lost for a few hours, but you always find your way out. Now, I like going on these short little trips just to unwind a bit. As I mentioned, they are just on weekends. I spend some time hiking. There are some really nice creeks and waterfalls in the area. There are a lot of birds and small wildlife, but they're not really any dangerous animals or anything like that. So all in all, these are just very relaxing trips. The most important thing to note, though, that these are not national parks or anything like that. They are private property, owned by the people I rent my home from, and I do have permission from them to do this. When this happened about 3 years ago, I got out hiking and camping. Heading out on a Friday afternoon, I walked along the creeks and camped near the waterfalls. This was very early fall, and the leaves had already changed and were fully falling by this point. I always enjoyed the sound of the scrunching of the leaves being walked upon. I even heard a few woodpeckers, which was cool. But all in all, it was a pleasant trip. About a week later, I got a small package in the mail. There was no return address on it, and it was sent using regular stamps. Opening it, I discovered one of those small USB flash drives. Confused, I decided to put it in my PC and see what was there, and what I saw terrified the hell out of me. There were dozens of video files, and each one of them was of my camping trip the previous weekend. The normal videos alone were scary enough. There were some of me hiking, setting up camp. There were some of me eating and things like that. But the truly scariest part of all the videos was the one that took place on the first night when I was camping by the waterfall. I was asleep in my tent. The only light was the light of the fire that I had built. In this video, I could hear crunching of the leaves. The perspective of the video was from the person, who I had no idea who it was, walking closer and closer towards my camp. He approached the fire, and I watched as someone's hands warmed themselves by the fire. After that, the person recording got up and walked over to my tent. I could see a shadow of my own body inside the tent. I could hear myself snoring lightly. The unknown person walked around my tent. He then flicked open a pocket knife. Now, even though I had experienced the camping trip, it was over, and I knew that I had not been injured in any way. I felt a lot of fear watching that. He fiddled with the knife, walking around the tent for a few minutes, then traced the tip of the blade against the tent, not waking me up. After several moments of doing that, the video ended. I was just in shock, and had no idea what to do. I didn't know who this was. I could tell just by the look of the hands that it was not the people who owned this land. And when I contacted them, they hadn't given anyone else permission to be there. The evidence was given to the police, but it was pretty much useless. The package was sent using regular stamps, so there was no way to track it. 3 years later, I still have absolutely no idea at all who had done this. I also have not been back camping in that area since. I just don't feel safe there anymore. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. A little confusion came out of my stream last night. I scheduled it for 7 a.m., but I did it a bit early because I hadn't been feeling good all weekend. I got caught out in the rain several times, including having wet shoes for 3 hours on Friday. Someone told me I sounded a little drunk, but I was just tired, and I'm probably going to do a stream this Friday. I'm not 100% decided, but it'll be advertised beforehand. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell below. We'll wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought of the video, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.